Today I'm going to go over the Sigma 16mm, 30mm, and 56mm prime lens set. I get a ton of questions about these lenses, so I'm going to try to cover all those things in this video. I'm going to go over the pros and cons of each lens. I'm going to go over what these lenses might be good for, what they might not be good for. So if you have any questions about the 16mm, the 30mm, and 56mm, I hope I can answer in this video. Let's start with the similarities. These are things that all these lenses have in common. And the first thing is the build quality. The build quality of all these lenses are pretty much exactly the same. They have the same style and design. The body is made of metal and the mount is metal, and they all pretty much feel like a very nice quality piece of glass. Another thing about these lenses, they are all very sharp. Even wide open at f1.4, they are very sharp. These lenses wide open are sharper than some lenses are when they stop down, so I have no problem shooting at f1.4 without worrying about losing detail or quality in the images. Speaking of f1.4, that is something that all these lenses have in common. They are all f1.4 lenses, so when people ask which one of these are better for low light, they pretty much are all exactly the same in low light. They all go to 1.4, so you won't have any trouble shooting with any of these lenses in low light. All three of these lenses have 9 aperture blades, and that just helps make the bokeh in the background more smooth. Usually the cheaper lenses have around 7 blades, and some of the more expensive lenses have 9 and sometimes even 11 blades. So the more blades, the smoother the bokeh in the background. And these lenses have 9 surprisingly for the price that they are priced at. And lastly, they all lack from stabilization. So if you need stabilization in your lens, these are not the lenses. None of them have stabilization. That may or may not be an issue for you, but none of them have it. Now, one thing they don't quite share in common is the performance. The 30mm came out first, then the 16mm, and then the 56mm. And I guess they kind of got progressively better as they came out, because the 30mm probably performs the worst out of the three, and then the 16 and the 56 performs the best. So far as autofocus, the 30mm focuses well, but it's not as good as the 16mm, which is not as good at the 56mm. But they're all acceptable, and I've never had an issue with focusing with any of them. But if you had to sit down and order them, the 30mm would perform the worst, and the 56mm performs the best. Now let's get into each lens specifically, and let's start with the 16mm. The 16mm is good in tight spaces. Like right now, I'm in a room that's about 5 feet wide, and I have the camera pushed back as far as I can to the wall, and I can still film myself because it's 16mm. If it was the 30mm or the 56mm, this shot right here wouldn't be possible. And this lens also has a very close minimal focus distance, so I can get pretty close to the lens and still be able to focus. Like right now, I'm literally about a foot away from the lens, and I have no problems getting focused this close. And I can actually get much closer to the lens and still be able to focus. And that's something you wouldn't be able to do with the 30mm or the 56mm. Also, being 16mm, the wider the focal length, the easier it is to hold handheld without having too much shake. So 16mm is wide enough to be able to hold handheld and have acceptable camera shake even without the stabilization. Now if you combine those things together, that makes this lens a pretty decent vlogging lens. Even though it's not stabilized, being at 16mm, it's wide enough to have acceptable camera shake, and it focuses close enough to where you don't have to worry about if you can focus on your face when you're holding it. Being a wide angle lens, that means this lens is good for anything that you want to show off the overall look of something. So landscapes, if you want to show off like buildings or anything that's a nice wide scene, it works perfect for. When I first bought this lens, I had no intentions of shooting any portraits with it, because I mean it's 16mm, and most of the time when you think about portraits, it's definitely not wide angle because of the distortion. But after giving it a try, I can say that this lens does perform pretty well with portraits if you are careful with it. If you're not too close to the subject or shooting at weird angles, you can definitely get some very nice portraits out of this lens, and it completely changed my perspective on this lens when I started doing that. So as far as portraits go, a lot of us want the shallow depth of field in the background, and that's very hard to do with a wide angle lens. But since it's f1.4, you still get a little background separation from your subject, even at such a wide focal length, and it shows the environment that your subject is in very well. So anytime you have a subject and you want to showcase the subject and the background and the environment that the subject is in, this might be the perfect lens for that. Now as we move on to the 30mm, this is pretty much your nifty 50 for an APS-C camera. So that makes this lens a pretty good all-around focal length. It will be even better than the 16mm for portraits, and it still will show a good bit of the background, so you won't lose that aspect. And it just pretty much works in most situations. And originally I probably would have recommended this lens over the 16mm, but every now and then you get in the situation to where the lens is not wide enough. So if you're somebody who has space is pretty much never a problem, then you might want to get the 30mm. But if you find yourself in a lot of different environments like staircases or small rooms or anything like that where you're confined with space and you have to work with what you got, the 16mm can pretty much do most of the things the 30mm can do and still give you the ability to use it in pretty much all scenarios. So yes, the 30 would be better for portraits, but the 16mm will give you a little more flexibility. So it's up to you on which will work for you. Also, I don't recommend you using this lens for handheld video because it's not stabilized, and at 30mm things get kind of shaky. So if that's something that you want to do, you might want to look into the Sony 35mm 1.8. It is stabilized. The image quality is not as good, but it's good enough if that's the situation that you're in. Now moving on to the 56mm, this is obviously going to give you the best portraits. If you do a lot of standard portrait work, this lens will definitely do that for you. It has an f1.4 aperture with an 84mm field of view, so you're going to get an extremely blurry background. Sometimes you can get the background so blurry that you can't even really tell what's behind them anymore. Only thing is you need to make sure you have enough space. This lens is not one that you can use in tight spaces, so make sure you have plenty of space to use this lens. One thing I noticed with shooting with this lens is that it limits the type of shots you can get because it's so zoomed in, you don't really get the background or the environment that the person is in. It's literally almost completely focused on the subject. You're basically eliminating the background completely. Anything else going on around your subject is pretty much going to get lost, and it's going to bring all attention to the subject. So if that's something that you want, the 56mm will definitely get that done for you. If you want to include more of the background and tell more of the story of the pictures, then the 30mm or maybe the 16mm will get that done better for you. But if you want to focus strictly on portraits and nice blurry backgrounds, this is the lens. I think another benefit of that is if you don't really have a nice location to shoot in, you can pretty much shoot anywhere, in front of a dumpster or a pile of trash. It doesn't really matter because this lens can completely blur the background out to where it's just swirls of color and nobody will be able to tell where you took the picture. Now with that being said, I wouldn't want this lens to be my only lens. If I only had a 56mm, I would be very limited, and a lot of things that I currently do, I wouldn't be able to do. It's a good second or third lens, but I wouldn't get this lens first. I would opt for the 16 or the 30mm, hands down. But of course, if you don't have any use for the other two lenses and the 56mm gets the job done for what you need, then go ahead and get it first. So let's rank the lenses for different situations. Starting with portraits, I would put the 56mm first, then the 30mm, then the 16mm. For fashion photography, you probably will want to show more of the outfit the person has on and maybe some of the environment to match the outfit with the environment and tell a story with it. So I would recommend the 30mm first, then the 16mm, and then the 56mm last. With street photography, you find yourself in all kinds of situations, so I would recommend the 16mm first for ultimate versatility, then the 30mm, then the 56mm. If you just like completely blurry backgrounds and maximum bokeh, you're gonna go for the 56mm first, then the 30mm, then the 16mm. For wedding photography, a lot of things are very unpredictable, so I would definitely have the 16mm first, then the 30mm, then the 56mm. The same will go for architectural photography because when you're working with buildings and interiors and things like that, you want nice wide shots. So 16mm first, then the 30, and then the 56 last. And if I had a choice to only have one of these lenses, then I would probably put the 16mm and the 30mm as a tie, and then the 56mm, because the 16mm and the 30mm are very interchangeable. It pretty much depends on the situation that you find yourself in. The 16mm is going to pretty much guarantee you to work in any situation, but if you're not in those situations where you're limited with space and stuff like that, then the 30mm will definitely handle pretty much anything as well. So it's a toss up between those two, and then the 56, of course, being the most limited, I'm going to put that one last. The benefit of owning all three lenses is that you can tell a complete story. You don't have to use one lens for one shoot. You can use all three or more if you have other lenses that you want to use, depending on the shots you want to get. So you can show a nice wide shot of whatever it is. You can show a tighter shot with the 30mm, or you can show a really detailed shot of something up close with the 56mm. So you can work them all together as one and tell a big story that you couldn't tell with just one lens on its own. Being that each lens has its own pros and cons, and when you work them together, it pretty much eliminates all the negatives and gives you all the positives of having all three. Now, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to say is you can pretty much throw everything I said out the window, because there's technically no rules to what you can and can't do with any of these lenses. Like I said earlier, I never thought about the 16mm being the portrait lens, but I took it out and shot portraits with it and I kind of fell in love with it. So just because I went over the standard, normal, typical uses of each lens, don't be afraid to use the lenses that I said didn't do good in those situations for those situations, because you will get a different look and a different style and you might like it. So don't be afraid to do things that don't necessarily make sense in the beginning. I'm just saying, for in most cases, these are the things you might want to look out for. But never be afraid to try things and mix things up. That's why I do these behind the scenes shoots with these lenses, so you can see the lenses and how they work in different situations. So I will have a lot more of those. So make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, follow me on Instagram, and I will see you guys next time.